Hi, this is Geordie Greep, and this is What's in My Bag.
To pay for a new
First of all, is Joe Zawinul. He was the guy that went on to do Weather Report, right? He was like the leader of Weather Report. This is one of his early albums in the 60s. It's called The Rise and Fall of the Third Stream. I don't know this album that well. I know a couple of tracks on it because they're on a compilation that I've got. And the vibe is like he's doing this kind of orchestral third stream kind of, in a word, kitschy music. I like kitschy stuff sometimes. And crossing over with someone who's a great kind of stylist and someone who really understands the instrument and had a firm sense of composition that he was interested in. He was working in kind of a weird, specific thing, which is jazz, which we had an emphasis on atmosphere. Almost ambient music before ambient music. There's this other album called Just Zawinul, which is basically an ambient album, and that's like 10 years before anyone was calling it that. This is Lester Bowie. He was also a leader of a band, one called the Art Ensemble of Chicago. And maybe the most noteworthy thing is the incorporation of humor. There was this kind of use of sound effects and use of kind of pastiches of Dixieland, New Orleans kind of music, but also classical music and popular music, and just a lot of the sort of thing that, you know, jazz music is often kind of very serious. And this guy thought, well, let's kind of make a concerted effort to not fall into that too much, you know, to not take it so seriously. I have this other album called Bowie's Brass Fantasy, and it's all brass band. And I think this album is the same sort of thing. Oh, there's drums and piano on this again, so I guess not. There's another one, is Gary Burton and Larry Coryell. Gary Burton is probably the greatest jazz vibraphone player. I mean, he's up there. And whether this is true or not, in the same way people say Eddie Van Halen's the first guy to do the tapping on the guitar, he's the first guy supposedly to use 4 mallets. He did a load of albums that kind of you could call fusion, potentially. And this is with Larry Coryell too. He's one of the first fusion guitar players. He basically invented a lot of the vocabulary that went on to become the fusion guitar style. This is the soundtrack of a movie called Novecento, which is a really interesting film. It's from the mid-70s, and it's another Bertolucci, the guy who made The Conformist, which is an all-out masterpiece film. And he also later made The Last Emperor and a few other, you know, noteworthy films. But this one, Novecento, is interesting because it's the sort of film that could have been the best film of all time, but definitely isn't. It's kind of really flawed. It's over 4 hours long, even 5 hours long. And it's full of like really extreme sex scenes which aren't simulated crazy violence or over-the-top kind of drama. Donald Sutherland is in it, and in a great role. De Niro is in it, and he's really not that good in it. But the soundtrack is by Ennio Morricone, and that's one of the things where when you watch this film, that's one thing that does come through of like, we know this sound. Jeff Beck, Wired. So this was a point in the mid-70s when Jeff Beck went completely into fusion. He did an album called Blow by Blow the year before, which has a great version of a Stevie Wonder track called 'Cause We've Ended as Lovers, and that's fantastic. That's really, really great. But this one is even more kind of goes into the jazz funk territory, and jazz funk and jazz rock, jazz funk. And it's got Jan Hammer on it, who's really amazing. He had a uniquely virtuosic control of the synthesizer. He was one of the first guys that could really make it sound like a guitar. This is a great, great album. And I think Jan Hammer even plays drums on one song, which is cool. This is Joni Mitchell's live album, Shadow and Light, from 1980, I think. Through the 70s, she was flirting with this kind of jazz vocabulary and working with jazz musicians and all this stuff. And by this album, she's touring live with a jazz fusion band. So like Pat Metheny's in the band, Jaco Pastorius is in the band. There's a live concert video of it, but this is the recording. And, you know, to be honest with you, it's out of all the Joni Mitchell stuff, I don't know this album that well. So that's why I bought it. This is an album by Garbarek. It's an ECM jazz album, so you kind of know what it's going to sound like before you heard it. It's going to be very beautiful and very atmospheric. It has Bill Frisell and Eberhard Weber on it. And John Christensen. It's a great band. But Eberhard Weber, he did these amazing, amazing albums in the mid to late 70s. The same kind of thing that Joe Zawinul was doing earlier, ambient jazz. It's at the risk of music sometimes, but I think he kind of rides that wave and manages to make the compositions interesting enough and the textures of sound. There's one album called Yellow Fields. It's like hardly anything that's been recorded since. But he's just the sideman on this album. I mean, maybe the influence goes over to Garbarek on Bill Frisell. This was at the beginning of his career. He went on to become less in the ambient genre, less in the kind of like tripping out genre, but he's a uniquely understated guitar player in some ways. And John Christensen, who plays on that album I was talking about, Yellow Fields with Eberhard, and he's a great, great drummer. He's an amazing Euro drummer from the 70s. I'm not gonna be shocked when I listen to this album, I don't think, but I think it's gonna be good. Roland Hanna, he's a great jazz pianist. It's a trio with Ron Carter and Ben Riley. He's one of my favorite pianists just because he has such a strong attack and he has a kind of, you can hear the lineage going back to Art Tatum, right, without it being a strict imitation or a kind of pastiche. He just plays things that most people would say is a bit cheesy, right? The kind of arpeggios he does and the kind of like phrasing and chord voicings is very old-fashioned in a way. But why not? If you can still have some kind of versatility to your playing, then why not embrace this old classic stuff? This is a recording of one of Olivier Messiaen's organ pieces. And the reason I'm getting this is because he's actually playing the organ, right? Which is pretty, you know, you don't see that too much. It's a weird one with classical music. Sometimes the composer's interpretation is not what you'd expect. So, for example, there's recordings of Stravinsky conducting his own works, and they're not great. They're not the recordings to listen to, really. It's interesting for sure, and I guess you have to say like, oh, well, if he wrote it, he knows how to perform it. But it's that old thing about, regardless of what you think it's about, an art work, whatever, book, movie, whatever the director or the writer thinks it's about, it's probably not what it's really about. Because once they do it and it's out there, it's not up to them, it's up to the world. My friend had a funny story he told me, this guy called Dan Carey, who produced the first album by Black Midi. He told me about how him and his family, they used to go on holiday in France in the 1980s. And one day he was in the middle of some village, whatever, in some church. It was the weirdest, strangest sound he'd ever heard, he said, the weirdest music going on in the church. And he was really young, single digits, 5 or 6. And years later, he found out that it was Olivier Messiaen practicing in the church. It's nice to know that something which is intellectualized and something does break through to someone young. So let's see how Olivier Messiaen sounds playing his own music. And the last one is Charles Lloyd. It's probably his most famous album is one called Forest Flower. And famously, it's the kind of debut of Keith Jarrett, who plays on this album. And he plays on that famous Forest Flower one. And this was the first group that he was in. I don't know this album. I just thought, why not? Let's get into it. I know Forest Flower, it's great, but this one I don't know. So let's see.
Awesome, Geordie. Thanks so much for sharing your picks with us today.
No worries, no worries. Good stuff. Good to be here.
Amoeba.